Tavira had worked here for many cycles. She had seen anatomy in every shape imaginable, creatures with skeletons like coral reefs, blood made of liquid silver, even a patient whose internal organs rearranged themselves depending on the phase of their homeworld's moon. To her, medicine was universal. Flesh tore, bone broke, cells mended. Her morning rounds began as usual. She adjusted the nutrient mist for a Graxian soldier recovering from plasma burns, checked the breathing membrane of a Morvex hatchling in incubation gel, and scanned the skeletal density of a Thrall ambassador who had survived a shuttle crash. Each action was methodical, each diagnosis precise. And then she reached bed 17. According to the chart hovering above the bed, the patient was a human male, designation Captain Ilias Ward. He had been brought in 3 rotations ago after surviving a catastrophic mining station collapse on Kevara 9. The report noted multiple fractures, blunt force trauma, oxygen deprivation, and significant blood loss, injuries that would have killed most species within minutes. Yet the human had not only survived but had carried 2 other sentients across nearly a kilometer of collapsed tunnels, sustaining further damage along the way. Humans. Tavira had treated them before, though never in such severe condition. They were strange beings, fragile in appearance, soft-skinned, with no claws, venom, or natural armor, yet somehow they endured on a world classified as a Class 10 death world. Their resilience was baffling. This one, though, looked different from the one she had encountered before, battered, but somehow still carrying a faint, restless energy even in unconsciousness. She keyed in the privacy barrier around his bed, a translucent shimmer closing them off from the rest of the ward. The scan she needed to perform required removing the thermal covering to inspect for untreated injuries. She told herself it was routine, purely medical. Nothing she hadn't done thousands of times. The thin sheet felt light as she drew it back. She began with the chest and abdomen, noting old scar tissue along his ribs, the kind earned through years of close encounters with danger. His breathing was steady, his muscles lean but corded with the density of someone accustomed to both strain and survival. And then her gaze fell lower. Tavira froze. Her black, unblinking eyes widened, and the delicate tendrils around her jaw stiffened, a reflexive Yathari response to shock. Between the human's legs was something unlike anything she had ever seen in all her medical experience. It was obviously an external organ, but it broke every evolutionary rule she knew. It was completely exposed, without armor plating, without a protective sheath, not even a layer of bony shielding. Its placement seemed by every survival standard reckless. Every other sapient species she knew kept reproductive structures internally or beneath layers of hard tissue, safe from the hazards of combat, predation, or environmental injury. Yet here it was, simply resting there as though defying the galaxy to question it. Her training urged her to remain clinical, to categorize it, to log it as just another anatomical variant. But the sheer audacity of such an exposed design left her momentarily unable to move. Vulnerable anatomy was something medics worked to shield at all costs, but humans apparently carried theirs into every battle, every dangerous mission, every precarious moment of life. She reached for her datapad, pulling up the standard galactic medical entry on Homo sapiens. The image on the file showed a polite internal schematic, as if deliberately avoiding the precise detail she now confronted. The entry only offered a single line: primary reproductive anatomy. Caution: sensitive. Sensitive. That was it? Sensitive did not begin to cover it. On Ythar, sensitive organs were secured behind 3 layers of bone and cartilage. On Graxia, they were housed inside retractable armored pouches. And yet, here humans were barely shielded at all and somehow thriving. For the first time in many rotations, Nurse Tuvira felt her professional composure falter. She looked down at the human patient still unconscious, still breathing steadily, and wondered if perhaps this was the truest mark of their dangerous nature. Not claws, not venom, not armor. Tuvira did not often find herself speechless. In her decades of service, she had treated species whose blood was flammable, whose skin excreted live bacteria colonies, and whose hearts were shaped like geometric crystals. But this was something else. She stood there for a long moment, torn between the urge to cover the human again and the compulsion to understand. Her tendrils twitched with unease. She knew humans were classified as apex survivors, but this external organ was a paradox. Why would evolution leave something so vital so utterly exposed? Her instincts screamed that this was a glaring weakness, one that any predator could exploit. Yet humans had not only survived for hundreds of thousands of years, they had spread across the galaxy, often thriving in places other species avoided. She needed answers. With her datapad still in hand, she brought up the human physiology file. The diagram was neat, clinical, and she realized deliberately vague about external reproductive features. The text offered almost nothing. A single woefully insufficient note read: primary reproductive anatomy. Caution. Sensitive. Sensitive? That was the understatement of the millennium. Sensitive meant eyes or antennae or certain nerve clusters. This was more than sensitive. It was an obvious strike point. Her training urged her to catalog it clinically, as she would for any alien anatomy, but her curiosity dug deeper. She had to know whether this was truly a flaw in design, or something else entirely. A low, rough sound interrupted her thoughts. She looked down to see the human stirring, eyelids fluttering open, his eyes deep brown like mineral-rich soil fixed on her. There was a flicker of alertness there, even through the haze of injury. "You," he rasped, voice dry from dehydration, "look like you've seen a ghost." Tuvira's frills flushed a pale orange, the Yathari sign of embarrassment. She almost looked away, but her training demanded she meet his gaze. "Your anatomy," she began carefully. "It is exposed. Vulnerable. Does it not hinder your survival?" The human blinked once, then of all things smiled faintly. "Not as much as you'd think." His voice was hoarse but steady. "Besides, we've survived just fine with it for a few 100,000 years." His tone was maddeningly casual, as if she had just asked him why he wore a particular shade of boots. Her brows knitted. "But surely predators." "Sure," he interrupted. "Predators, accidents, combat, it's all a risk. But so is having a neck. Or eyes, or a brain. You protect it, that's all." She hesitated, glancing down again before quickly averting her gaze. "On Ythar," she explained, "such structures are hidden deep within the body. On Graxia, they are encased in bone. On Vorla, they are detachable and regrow. Yet you carry yours into danger without armor." The human chuckled, actually chuckled, despite cracked ribs and bandaged arms. "Guess you could say we like living dangerously." To Tuvira, this was nothing short of insanity. Vulnerability was a thing to be minimized, eliminated if possible. But here was a species that wore it openly, and judging by the glint in his eye, without shame. Her mind reeled with questions. Did this mean humans placed extraordinary trust in their protective instincts? Did they evolve to survive not in spite of vulnerability, but because of it? Or was this simply a strange evolutionary oversight they had learned to compensate for? "You seem—" She paused, searching for the word. "Unconcerned." He shrugged lightly, wincing at the movement. "Everything's got a weak spot. Ours just happens to be obvious. We've learned to guard it." His gaze softened then, a flicker of humor mixing with something more serious. "But sometimes Being vulnerable reminds you what's worth protecting. Tavira didn't fully understand the sentiment, but the conviction in his voice was unmistakable. She decided to cover him again, carefully pulling the sheet back over his form. As she stepped away to finish her rounds, the image of that exposed, unarmored organ lingered in her mind, not in a clinical sense anymore, but as a symbol. The image of the human patient, Captain Elias Ward, still lingered in her mind, but not in the way she expected. It wasn't the shape of the organ that preoccupied her now. It was the audacity of its existence. Humans were a death world species. Their homeworld, Earth, was infamous among xenobiologists for its volatile climates, violent predators, and relentless diseases. Most creatures from such worlds developed extreme protective adaptations: dense hides, venom sacs, retractable claws, or heavily shielded reproductive systems. But humans? They walked around with one of their most vital biological systems practically. UNARMORED.Y? She began by pulling up the full Encyclopedia Xenobiologica entry on Homo sapiens. The public file was limited, mostly for medical personnel and xenobiology students. It listed their skeletal composition, cardiovascular endurance, rapid healing rates, and unusually complex immune system. But when she reached the reproductive anatomy section, the data was maddeningly incomplete, just another polite, sanitized schematic that carefully avoided anatomical frankness. So she dug deeper. She bypassed the public server and accessed the restricted research logs reports compiled by military medics, xenobiologists stationed on Earth, and field anthropologists. Here, the information was more candid. She learned that humans were exceptional endurance hunters, capable of running prey to exhaustion across open terrain. This ability, combined with their sweat-based cooling system, allowed them to survive physical exertion that would kill most species. And here, buried in the physiology notes, she found a partial answer. Temperature regulation of reproductive tissue requires external positioning. It was a simple statement, but it changed everything. Humans didn't choose this vulnerability. It was a byproduct of another survival advantage. By keeping certain tissues cooler than the core body temperature, they maintained reproductive viability in a species that could run for hours under intense heat. Still, this only explained how it happened, not why it persisted in a galaxy where every predator, parasite, and environmental hazard could target it. Evolution usually removed traits that invited extinction. The fact that this had endured for hundreds of thousands of years meant humans had found other ways to protect its social, behavioral, perhaps even psychological. The report supported this theory. Human culture, across countless eras and civilizations, showed patterns of extreme protective behavior toward this region of the body. Warnings were passed down to offspring. Physical blows aimed there were considered dishonorable, or in some human societies, the most dishonorable of all. There were even documented cases of humans risking their lives to shield it during combat. She leaned back in her chair, tendrils curling in thought. This was not the behavior of a species oblivious to its weakness. This was the behavior of a species that knew its weaknesses and still pressed forward into danger. Another report caught her attention, a psychological analysis, written by a joint Ythari-Terran research team. It argued that humans did not view vulnerability as inherently negative. In fact, human literature, art, and even combat traditions often celebrated the idea of exposing a weakness in order to demonstrate trust, bravery, or defiance. Vulnerability, to them, could be a weapon. The concept unsettled her. In Ythari culture, weakness was something to be hidden, eradicated if possible. But humans seemed to treat it differently, not as a flaw to be erased, but as a reality to be managed, adapted to, even embraced. She thought back to the way Elias Ward had spoken earlier, calm, almost amused by her shock. He hadn't acted ashamed or defensive. If anything, he had seemed to view her concern as almost endearing. Her datapad chimed with the time. She should have been asleep long ago. But instead, she bookmarked the files and made a silent note to continue her research. Something told her that understanding this strange paradox of human design might reveal more than just a quirk of anatomy. It might explain why humans were such unpredictable survivors, why they could face overwhelming odds and still emerge bloodied, battered, but alive. The organ itself was simply biology. But the fact that humans lived with it, protected it, and yet refused to let it dictate the boundaries of their courage, that was something else entirely. And Tavira was beginning to suspect it was the key to understanding the dangerous, fascinating truth of humanity. She had begun to notice something else. Humans didn't like being still. Even injured, Elias had an alertness to him, an undercurrent of readiness, as though waiting for trouble to appear. It made her uneasy, and as she would soon learn, it was justified. On the fourth day of his stay, the quiet of the recovery ward shattered. The first warning came as a tremor in the floor, small but sharp. Then the low rumble of an alarm began to pulse through the walls. Red emergency lights cut across the soothing blue, and an automated voice announced in galactic standard, "Security breach. Unauthorized armed personnel within the facility." Tavira S. Frills stiffened. A hospital was rarely a target unless someone inside was valuable politically, militarily, or economically. She thought immediately of the injured Threll ambassador down the hall, but the security system's targeting markers on her datapad told her the attackers were moving directly toward this ward. A muffled series of thuds like compressed air. Detonations echoed from somewhere below. The sound of weapons. She ducked behind the central counter, pulling out her personal communicator to call for backup. But before she could transmit, a voice came from behind her. "You should hide somewhere." "Safer." She turned. Elias was standing, leaning slightly to one side, but on his feet nonetheless. He had pulled the thermal sheet around his waist like an improvised garment and held a metal food tray in one hand as though it were a shield. "You are injured," she said, unable to keep the alarm from her voice. "Your anatomy, your most vulnerable region, is exposed. If they strike there," he actually grinned, the absurd expression stark against the flashing red lights. "Lady, everything's vulnerable if you don't protect it." That grin unsettled her in ways she couldn't define, because it wasn't the smile of someone reckless. It was the smile of someone confident in what would happen next. The ward. Doors hissed open. 2 mercenaries in matte black armor stormed in, weapons raised. Their visors reflected the red light as they swept the room. One spotted Elias immediately. Target sighted. Tavira ducked lower, expecting him to freeze. Instead, Elias moved fast. His first step was a feint, drawing the nearest mercenary forward, then he slammed the food tray into the weapon, knocking it sideways. With his other hand, he grabbed the mercenary's arm and yanked hard, twisting the opponent into the path of incoming fire from the second attacker. The shot struck armor and ricocheted. Elias didn't wait, he pivoted, driving a knee into the first mercenary's torso, then slammed their helmet into the wall with a hollow clang. The second mercenary advanced, raising their weapon again. Elias didn't charge recklessly. Instead, he circled, using the first fallen opponent's bulk as partial cover. Tavira noticed, even in her fear, how instinctively he kept his midsection turned away from direct fire shielding that most vulnerable region without ever slowing his attack. A sharp, metallic thunk rang out as Elias hurled the dented food tray into the second attacker's visor. The mercenary staggered, and Elias closed the distance in 3 long strides, wrenching the weapon away and smashing the butt of it into the side of their helmet. Both attackers were down within seconds. Elias stood over them, chest rising and falling, not with panic but with controlled breaths. He checked each body, ensuring they were incapacitated, then looked toward Tivira. "You all right?" he asked, as if she were the one who had been in danger. She stepped out from behind the counter, her mind still processing what she had seen. His movements had been calculated, efficient, and most strikingly always mindful of that so-called vulnerability. He hadn't ignored it. He had worked with it, adjusting every strike and dodge to protect it without hesitation. "You fought." She began slowly, "As though you have done this before?" Elias gave a wry smirk. "Protecting your weak points is just basic survival. Doesn't matter if you're human or not." He picked up the discarded thermal sheet, wrapping it more securely around his waist. "But sometimes the best way to survive is to make the other guy worry about his weak points first." Tivira found herself staring not at the anatomy that had first shocked her, but at the way he carried himself. It wasn't the absence of weakness that made humans dangerous. It was their ability to acknowledge vulnerability and still run headlong into danger. The aftermath of the attack left the recovery ward smelling faintly of scorched metal and ozone. Security officers had arrived within minutes of Elias subduing the mercenaries, and the intruders were now restrained and being hauled away for questioning. The red emergency lights faded, replaced once again by the calming blue glow of the ward. Tivira moved automatically at first, checking patients, verifying life signs, restoring the room to its pre-attack order, but her attention kept drifting. Back to bed 17. Elias Ward had returned to it without prompting, his breathing calm, his demeanor steady, as though breaking two armed mercenaries was simply another item on his recovery checklist. She approached him slowly, unsure how to begin. Her hands moved to his bandages, removing the upper layers to inspect the damage. Several wounds had reopened. A bruise was darkening across his ribs. He didn't flinch when she touched them, though she could feel the tension in his muscles. "You risked aggravating every injury you have," she said, her voice carefully even. "Your body is still recovering. You could have stayed hidden until security arrived." He glanced at her, a faint grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "And if they'd gotten to you before then? Or one of the other patients? Hiding only. Works until someone finds you." She pressed the scanner against his side, watching the readouts. "You could have died." "Yeah," he said simply, as though it were the most natural acknowledgement in the galaxy. "But so could you. And I figure if I'm alive tomorrow, I can heal. If I'm dead, it doesn't matter how careful I was today." That line struck her harder than she expected. Among the Ithari, vulnerability was something you avoided at all costs, physically, socially, even emotionally. Entire traditions had been built on maintaining defensive distance from anything that might expose a weakness. But here was a human who had just risked his life and his most fragile anatomy, not for victory or glory, but to keep others safe. She finished replacing his bandages and pulled the thermal sheet back over him. "When I first saw you," she admitted quietly, "I thought your anatomy was flawed, weak. I could not understand how your species survived with such a dangerous design." Elias chuckled, a low sound that didn't feel mocking. "We've had plenty of close calls. But here's the thing, every species has weak points. Ours just happen to be obvious, so we guard them. We build habits around them. And sometimes we use them to remind ourselves that nothing makes you tougher than knowing exactly where you're breakable." She tilted her head. "You embrace weakness?" "Not exactly," he said. "We just accept it. Pretending it's not there doesn't make it go away. Knowing it's there, that makes you fight smarter, makes you plan, makes you value what you've got left." Tivira was quiet for a moment, letting his words settle in her mind. She thought of all the species she had treated over the years, creatures with armor-like hides who still fell to disease, beings with redundant organs who still bled out when the wrong vessel ruptured, apex predators who still made fatal mistakes. No life form was invincible. But humans didn't try to be. Instead, they seemed to carry their fragility as part of their identity, an open challenge to the universe. We are vulnerable. And we're still here. When she finally spoke again, her voice was softer. Perhaps that is why you survive when others do not. You do not deny weakness, you adapt to it. You fight anyway. Elias's grin widened slightly. That's one way to put it. He settled back against the bed, closing his eyes, clearly ready to rest at last. The trick isn't to live without weakness. It's to make damn sure your weakness doesn't stop you from living. Tavira lingered beside his bed a moment longer, studying the human who had, in a matter of days, overturned one of her most deeply held beliefs about survival. When she finally moved away, it was with a new understanding not just of human biology, but of the philosophy that shaped them. It wasn't their claws or teeth or armor that made humans dangerous. It was their refusal to let vulnerability dictate their limits.